Dufu on Yueyang Tower. Long ago, I heard about the waters of Dongting. At last, I have climbed Yueyang Tower to view them. Wu and Chu, east and west, are split by the lake. Heaven and earth, day and night, float in its waters. From friends and relatives, not a word of news. Old and ill, I have nothing but my little boat. War horses fill the passes to the north. I lean on the guardrail, sobbing and weeping. So, this is the 10th and last of the pentasyllabic regulated poems by Dufu included in this anthology. As we've been saying, these poems seem to be placed in some sort of a chronological order, and the previous poem we read, written while traveling at night, is probably one of Dufu's last poems, so this one would be from approximately the same period, maybe a little earlier, maybe a little later. As we've said, Dufu, during the last years of his life, mainly traveled through the Jiangsu River with his family in a boat, making stops along the way in places where he might encounter patronage. Now, this is towards the end of his voyage. In the middle-late course of the Jiangsu, we have the lakes region, which was the heartland of the old state of Chu. The biggest, or one of the biggest of these lakes, is Lake Dongting, and on the corner of Lake Dongting there is a city called Yueyang. Certainly Dufu must have reached this city at the time of composing this poem, as he is describing in it a view that he has, along with the reflections that he feels, while he is climbing that tower, which would have been one of the city towers of the town of Yueyang, with good views of Lake Dongting in front of it. If you remember, if you pull back your memory, you will remember that we've already had a poem in this area by Dufu. It was one of the heptasyllabic old-style poems, the one sent to Grand Master of Remonstrance Han Zhu. In that poem, Dufu was still not in the city of Yueyang. He was on the other side of the river, and he was frustrated at not being able to cross it so as to visit the city of Yueyang and his friend Han Zhu living there. But you may imagine the poems are from approximately the same time. So what is the topic of this poem? So it's very similar in a way to the previous poem that we have read. You could say the main topic of the poem, or rather 50-50. The main topic would be Dufu's disappointment. You know, the way in which the poem finishes, the last line with the poet crying, I think you know it synthesizes the tone of the poem. So it's a poem about old age, about disappointment in one's expectations, about troubled times, public and personal disappointments. It's also, up to a point, you could say, it's also a landscape poem, although not much, because you don't get much of a description either of Yueyang Tower or of the region that surrounds it, the lake and the old territories there. The description is pretty summary. After all, this is a Lushi, a regulated poem. It's not very big, so it's not very adequate for a long landscape description, as an old-style poem probably would be. There is another subtheme, which we've talked about a lot. Remember, in old Chinese society and culture and in the poetry, climbing elevated structures is, always has a symbolic meaning. And whether it be natural constructions like mountains or hills, or whether it be man-made buildings like towers or gates or pavilions or terraces. So there is a basic metaphor at play here, which we've talked about before. The physical elevation and the expansion of the view that one gets from being in a high position is equated with intellectual and interior insight. So insight is a very good English word, which very visually represents this idea of seeing, but not seeing with one's eyes, but seeing with something else. There's knowledge attained through the mind, through thoughts, through reflection. So when a Chinese poet climbs a mountain or a tower, he's not just going to tell us what he sees from the top. He's probably going to share with us some piece of enlightenment, some piece of insight, of knowledge that he has been able to reach while in such an elevated position. And this is the case with Du Fu's poem on Yueyang Tower. It's not like the insight he discovers is something he hasn't told us about in previous poems, so it's not just completely new, but it's this idea that climbing up, one sees better. One sees better not only the landscape, one sees better with the eyes of the mind. Okay, so let's take a look at the poem as we usually do, couplet by couplet, and comment a little bit about it. Long ago I heard about the waters of Dongting. At last I have climbed Yueyang Tower to view them. So the poem starts by introducing itself. The title already introduces the locus in which the poem is located, that Yueyang Tower. The poet's first couplet introduces this in detail. It says, well, I've thought a lot about, I've heard about Dunting Lake. It's a famous lake in China. So, any scholar official, any Chinese from this period would have known about Lake Dunting, which would have acted as one of the famous landscapes to be viewed in a lifetime if one traveled to the south of China. So now Du Fu is in the south of China, and he is going to make good use of his presence at Yueyang to climb its gate tower and to gaze at the lake and enjoy the view. Second couplet. Now the second couplet, very rigidly parallelistic, and I think that's easy to see in this translation, shows us the sights from the tower. Wu and Chu, east and west, are split by the lake. Heaven and earth, day and night, float in its waters. So this couplet is not actually a description of what is seen. It's more of a kind of summary of elements that pertain to this lake or are associated with the lake, or information about Lake Dongting and its area, more than a strict description of what is seen. So the first line locates it geographically through a series of interstitial positions, if you wish. This lake is the midpoint between different places, different spaces. So it's between the old kingdoms of Wu and Chu, just on the frontier. And east and west, those old regions are separated by the lake. The lake was in the past, you could say, a liminal place, a liminal space that separated, but also in a way got together, the old southern kingdoms of Wu and Chu. But not only does it separate geographically and territorially, there's also an up and down axis here. Heaven and earth, day and night, float in its waters. So, the lake seems to act in a sort of liminal and frontier style, also by separating on its waters the heavens and the earth, the day and the night. Or, this image wants to be continued in the second line of the couplet of the lake making separations. So it's not actually clear how day and night, heaven and earth, can float on the waters, or what is really meant by this. Like you can see the waters during the day and during the night, or that, you can look up and see the heavens and look down from the lake and see the land. But anyway, the image or the images that are being transmitted continue this line of the lake as a liminal space, as a space in between other spaces, whether these be Wu and Chu, territorial old kingdoms, or whether it be heaven on earth, up and down axis elements, or whether it be day and night, which is time symbols, if you wish. So with this couplet, we finish the more descriptive part of the poem, and now we get the introspections, what Du Fu is feeling or thinking while he is up in the tower. From friends and relatives, not a word of news. Old and ill, I have nothing but my little boat. So his thoughts are sad indeed. They're not very enthusiastic thoughts. Even if the landscape is beautiful, it has not managed to penetrate, to make a chink in the armor of Du Fu's desolate spirit. Why is he sad? He's got no news from friends or relatives. He is isolated, which a Chinese scholar official would loathe for reasons we've talked about in previous poems. A Confucian sees himself as a social animal, a social creature. The idea of being isolated from society and from other individuals is, a little hell on earth for any Confucian worth his salt, worth his oats. And not only friends and relatives, but Du Fu's physical condition is deteriorating. He is old and he is ill and he is poor. So, pretty dark times for the poet. Finally, the last couplet synthesizes these feelings and also seems to be giving an explanation for why this communication with friends and relatives is broken. And we know that we are in the aftermath of the An Lushan rebellion, which took many years to extinguish. It's still raging in some parts of the country. And that's what the last couplet will hint at. War horses fill the passes to the north. I lean on the guardrail, sobbing and weeping. As usual in Du Fu, we get this synthesis of personal and public grief, of the personal pain of Du Fu at being isolated in the south, away from family and friends, old, ill, poor, and at the same time the distress of the nation, still immersed in civil war, the north still desolate, the paths and roads still cut off, war horses moving here and there. So there is this combination of the plight of the nation and the plight of the individual, which is a trademark of Du Fu's poems. And the poem ends on a sad note, and an expressively sad note. Not only does the poem tell us of sad feelings, he cries physically. Yeah, he sobs and weeps while holding to the guardrail of Yueyang Tower. So a pretty sad poem, like the previous one. Perhaps a little bit, I wouldn't say less visual, but perhaps the images are more concrete, more Chinese, and therefore less universal than in the previous poem. But it's a nice poem and very similar to Written While Traveling at Night. So quite a nice piece. And I imagine that this poem contributed, if it wasn't already quite famous, to the successive fame of the Yueyang Tower, turning it into a landmark that any poet imitating Du Fu and visiting the South should stop at.